We're recording. All right.
Okay, and a couple of announcements. Tomorrow's trip to Chisholm. I plan to drive. I don't quite know what we're going to get when we get there. But the meeting is nominally on climate change, and the CCLers from Two Harbors and Duluth are presenting. And I suspect a bunch of mining companies will be there, and maybe a bunch of politicians will be there. 9:30 to 10 is a meet and greet. So if you want to buttonhole people that may be there, that's worth your while to go. I will be driving. I have 2 slots. So if somebody wants to carpool with me, please let me know in time to make plans. All right, it's Brian and me right now. The other issue is the 21st of November. We have a Tuesday group with health professionals for a healthy climate, who are a very prestigious group of MDs and nurses and public health people who testify at hearings within the state and do all manner of good outreach stuff. Mary Louise found them actually originally, made contact. And 3 of them are coming up here, weather permitting, to give a presentation. They're also going to try to interact with the clinic and hospital and potentially with the school board on pushing to get electric school buses. Minnesota is way behind, for example, we're behind Michigan in getting electric school buses. So would be nice to get some more of those.
There's money for those.
That's right,
Yes.
but not enough. Never enough. There are a lot of school buses. So all of that's happening in November. In December, Tuesday group has a holiday hiatus, and I think we should too. So let's maybe have an organizational meeting. I would really like to have helpers getting this all organized. And we could talk about dates. This date, the Tuesday, second Tuesday, is particularly bad for some people. So I'd like to just sort of talk about that. So I'm not thinking about a real climate meeting, just a meeting about climate meetings.
In December.
In December, yeah. So I'll send out an email, and please come if you can, and don't feel guilty if you can't, except for some of you who really ought to come.
You know.
Whatever that means.
You know who you are.
Okay, so we've got Aaron here today, and we're very happy to have him. Go, Aaron.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. And thanks Barb for working with me on the schedule and the invitation. And I have to say, for those that don't ever see this on the recording, she did all of that from memory with no notes. And that was wonderful. Just how much you have going on, and to hear that. I definitely appreciate the invitation. I know Ely is a very passionate, engaged community, and it's wonderful as a district ranger with the Forest Service to have such a wide network right in my backyard to talk to at will and share ideas and learn from. I think often of like the education of a district ranger. It'd probably make a good book for someone. Because district rangers come from all sorts of backgrounds and all sorts of educations and experiences, and are really thrown into a whole mix of different situations and scenarios and forests and communities. And it's just really important for us as district rangers to be humble and to be open to new ideas and different thoughts and different people's perspectives and experiences. So I came from a background out west as in law enforcement. I was a law enforcement ranger with the Bureau of Land Management. And so I have a real general background in natural resources. Before that, my undergrad is in history. I thought I was going to be a history teacher, and but I hunted a lot, and I used the outdoors a lot as a river guide, and just out on public lands, and I'd bump into stewards of our public lands, Forest Service and Park Service, and I always thought, I never knew a job like that. Like they'll pay you to go out and do what you want to do. And I was substitute teaching, and I was like, I just really don't want to be under fluorescent lights all day, and I'd rather be outside. And I said, maybe I'll just go in that direction. And lo and behold, here I am in Ely after a long journey. But coming to Ely in May of 2020, thinking about the education of a district ranger is, I was really fortunate in some of the neighbors I had when I moved here. So Thea Sheldon, some of you may know, and Polly Carlson Boyles were some of the first people I met. And Polly, she gave me a list of 25 people, and she said, you need to meet these 25 people. And I still have that list, and I've checked most of them off, not all of them, but it was nice because it was during COVID. And so a lot of times it was just simply having a cup of coffee and meeting people and saying, like, what do I need to know coming here? Like, what's important and what can I do? And so that whole long discussion brings us to, eventually meeting Barb and, the climate group and hearing and seeing the work of the climate group here. And so Barb was generous to extend an invitation, and I did caveat my acceptance of the invitation saying, I will probably learn more from you than you will learn from me. And I truly believe that. I think I learned more from these than you probably get out of me. So there we go. And fortunately, I made notes. I don't always make notes. I just kind of wing it. But there is something that Mark Twain said once that, sorry, I didn't have more time to write you a shorter letter. And I think taking notes helps like condense and get to the point. And also wanting to learn from you. If I can keep it kind of brief, I'll keep it brief so that we have more time to ask and answer questions. And then also I know right after this is Tuesday group, and a lot of you skedaddle so you can get front row seats and get lunch ordered. So and knowing that Doug's in the room, and I've learned from other presentations with Doug, if I don't say climate change 5 times, he's going to ask me why I don't say climate change. So climate change, climate change, climate change, climate change, climate change. I said it. And now I probably won't say it again.
Try put it in context.
You always set a high bar, So, and the other thing Barbara and I talked about too is that, being able to speak at a really kind of general overview level of, kind of forest management, and particularly fire management, fire dependent ecosystem that we live in, some general concepts so that not only today, but in the future or even in the past, the way the agency responds to wildfires or the management we do in between wildfires. So when you're driving around in the forest or you're out skiing and you're like, what the heck happened here? Kind of as a community, understanding some of these general concepts is really helpful, because I think we end up having better discussions if we kind of have a same basis of understanding. And then, but what we talked about is, I think you'll all benefit from more science. And so one of my employees, Jeff Kroll, is our soil scientist. And he's just done really cutting edge research post-fire, particularly with the Greenwood fire, doing some LiDAR and unmanned aircraft studies of the peat that was burned during the Greenwood fire and the contribution to carbon and climate change caused by that wildfire in particular, but then generalizing that. So Barb is working with Jeff to schedule a future date that's probably going to dive more into the details. So what I've come to learn, and not being a scientist, but being an avid consumer of information, is that there's two really broad and I call dual fire regimes. And so most all of you either knew or know of Bud Heinzelman and Bud Heinzelman's book, Ecology of the Boundary Waters. And in that book, he really talks about these rather catastrophic stand replacing fires, these major fires, like for instance, the Pagami fire. And, over the last hundreds of years, he used aerial photographs and he kind of mapped out fire perimeters, and then he went out and cored those trees and figured out what that timeline was. But he was really looking at this real landscape level, fire history and these what we would call catastrophic fires. And then the other fire regime is a low intensity but a high frequency fire regime, which would be more of an indigenous fire use on the land. And there's a lot of research that's happened lately, and I refer often to People, Fire, and Pine is the research paper that came out, which was a group of scientists that published that here just a couple years ago. And that's been fairly influential and really complements the work that Heinzelman completed and is kind of that next chapter of what Heinzelman was working on. But a lot of times too, people think of just a sentient forest, a forest with no disturbance. And I think at a certain point of ecology, that was the kind of model that was developed, is like, something happens and the forest progresses nicely and smoothly through the progression until there's a dominant sentient forest that is just really super stable and nothing happens, and people are involved and life is good. And so there, I think historically, maybe currently, there's kind of this idea that forests are just these really stable things that progress through to just a stable environment. And there probably are places that are like that. And I grew up in Connecticut, and we have these hardwood forests, oaks and maples. There wasn't a lot of fire in that environment. Really kind of the most disturbance we would get is if a hurricane came through and came all the way up, or like some sort of nor'easter or something. But and just thinking about forest types, like, so those stable forests that don't have a lot of disturbance are generally like your hardwoods, like your maples. You have like some cedar forests. Cedar forests are generally fairly stable, or like even peatlands. Like if you think of peat, like long intervals without any disturbance. So it does happen. There are forest types that are very stable and kind of progress. I think the average return interval for a disturbance in a maple forest, like back east, is about like 1400 to 1700 years between disturbances. So super stable, if nothing else is taking place. Like, but again, it's generally wind that causes those disturbances.
And that number for us is what?
Well, so brilliant question. It depends. And so for us, like if you look at the Heinzelman, those catastrophic or stand replacing fires, you're generally looking at like an aspen fir forest that's obviously not been logged, or there's not been a harvest in there. And so those forests will go, kind of like, say there's a stand replacing fire. And then the aspen grow up, aspen get like 90 odd years old, but then the balsam fir kind of grows in the shade underneath them. And that balsam gets big and then it dies about 40-50 years later, whether it's spruce budworm or drought or whatever. And then you have a stand replacing fire. So it could be, 100-150 years, and then you get those disturbances. Or you get no disturbance and that balsam kind of dies and it decomposes, and then the next generation of aspen come up. So you get this aspen fir cycle. When that fir does burn, it'll burn that whole stand and just reset it. You get jack pine. Jack pine is, very much known as a fire dependent tree, because the cones need heat to open up. It's kind of fun. Next time you're all on a Boundary Waters trip or you're near a jack pine, I don't know why we do it, but every time we go into Boundary Waters, like our whole family takes all the jack pine cones and we set them on the fire grate at different distances. And we watch them open up, and it's surprising how little heat they actually need. But like, we can't resist. My whole family, we just we just do it. It's a thing. We're mesmerized by it. And so those you're looking at like 75 to 90 years generally, of some sort of really a catastrophic fire replacing that whole stand, releases all those millions of seeds, and then you get really a homogeneous jack pine forest return. They really need that disturbance. And then a lot of the black spruce. So you'll see it in black spruce forests where you have a drought, and then you'll have a stand replacing fire in black spruce. And generally those, again, like in that 75-year time frame, you're seeing that return into black spruce. What we're seeing these days, likely due to climate change, is that return interval in black spruce is happening quicker and quicker. And I was up on a fire up in Alaska, the Swan Lake fire, which is on the Kenai Peninsula, and they were really noticing, it's a Fish and Wildlife National Wildlife Refuge landscape in a fantastic canoe area. Everybody gets up there, but it was set aside for moose, and that fire return interval has been happening quickly, more on the order of like every 25 years. And that spruce at roughly 25 years is when it starts going to seed again. And so if you get a fire return interval before the trees seed, then you can get to the point where there's no new generation. And so they're having a fairly vibrant conversation about that area actually turning into a grassland and not being moose habitat. And they're actually talking about like, would buffalo be the species up here? And it was kind of a really fascinating, like, real thought exercise. So, and then in Canada, we saw this summer, all those fires in Canada are mostly black spruce areas. And just, so we'll have to watch, because if that fire return interval speeds up, then that area might convert to grasslands as well. And then if you look at our red pine and white pine, that dual fire regime is really interesting to watch. So with an indigenous culture, generally you're seeing a fire return interval of like, say, every 5 to 25 years, or even on Minnesota Point over by Duluth, there's some really great research that's happening there. And they can like just microscopically look at the growth rings on those trees, and they can tell when those fires occurred, spring, summer, or fall. And there's actually growth rings on Minnesota Point where that area burned both spring and fall. And there are time periods where it was annually burned. And it's really interesting talking to some Ojibwe scholars of generally on Wisconsin Point is where the habitation was, the camping was, and then Minnesota Point is where the like hunting gathering took place. but that was getting burned routinely, like annually or even twice a year. And it, you know, those who walk down a Minnesota Point, or if you're ever down in Duluth, take a trip out there, it's fantastic. And just see those old growth red and white pine. And that's really a very frequent, low intensity, high frequency fire return interval. But then at times, like sometimes every 400 years, 350 to 400 years, you'll get a stand replacing fire, which is in essence, fire will carry across the crowns of the trees and just take it out completely. And then you might get, I was noticing on my drive in this morning, you know, you probably, that stand replacing fire might come back in like an aspen forest, but there's enough seed or enough residual individuals seeding that aspen forest grows up, it ages out. But during that time, those white pines were coming up underneath. And so when that aspen forest ages out, now those white pines have kind of seeded in and shaded out that next generation of aspen. And so kind of that, again, conversion, you know. So it's really interesting, these forests we live in, just seeing that cycle and what forest type needs what kind of disturbance to be really healthy. We'll pause for just a second, make sure we're tracking good. So carbon, that's kind of what brought us here, is, you know, so each of those different forest types act differently with the carbon cycle. And so so generally, like, no other disturbance, right? If we're looking at more of a historical, say 200 years ago, fire cycle where it's only, say, indigenous, there's no European interaction like logging or all the other activities we do, we would have seen this landscape as being probably much more open. You look at some of those early photos of like Burnside Lake or Basswood Lake, this whole area there would have been a lot less trees here. It would have been tremendously open. And you do hear stories like the Vermilion Trail when that first started. Like, I mean, they just drove wagons up the Vermilion Trail. And there's just no way you could do that now. I hear stories on Vermilion Lake where they just came along the south shore of Vermilion Lake in wagons, and that's where the first town up here was founded. And it was just so open. And you see that a lot in photos, just how open it was here. And that was really that fire cycle allowed. There was the natural fire cycle, right? Those large catastrophic fires, but there was also the indigenous fire cycle of high frequency, low intensity fire. And so the way the forest stored carbon then and cycled carbon, there was probably a lot less carbon on the land, if that makes sense. There was a lot less carbon in the trees and in the woody material. There's probably a lot more carbon in the soil itself, and particularly in the peatlands, because there probably wasn't a lot of like high intensity fire that was getting into the peatlands. And so those peatlands would go hundreds and hundreds of years without any fire in them. So, you know, holistically looking at carbon, my assumption is that there was less carbon in the trees and more carbon in the soil. If you look rather generally across the forest now, we have a lot of trees out there. We have a lot of, you could say, stems per acre. We have very dense forests that you can't really see through. There's a overstory and an understory. So you got these big pines, and then you got the balsam underneath, and there's just a lot of carbon in the woody material now. That's kind of built up over the last 150 years or so after the, I'll get to you in a few, Doug. That'll be the question and answer. I'm watching the clock, following my notes. So there's really a shift. And then what you see now because of that shift is when there is a catastrophic wildfire, a large wildfire, say Pagami or greenwood, there's a tremendous release of that carbon. And when that carbon's released, the carbon in the wood is released, but also a lot of that carbon in the soil is released, or in the peatlands is released, like particularly in the greenwood fire. So the homework I sent out with the link, that video, if anybody's had a chance to read it, it's the education of a district ranger. It was really helpful. I've watched that thing probably 3 or 4 times now, and every time I watch it, I learn something new. But what they talk about in there a lot is that high frequency, low intensity fire ends up ultimately storing more carbon in the forest, because it ends up putting more carbon into the soil. And the carbon that ends up in the soil, if it's like saying charcoal or a log that doesn't consume entirely, but you see that coal on the log, that's a much more stable way to hold carbon. You may have seen in Japan some of that where they'll actually burn, say, cedar, and then it ends up as a finish, and those buildings are thousands of years old and they have this char finish on them. It's a really stable way to hold carbon. And then the other thing with that low intensity fire regime is that your catastrophic wildfires are kind of slowed down and don't generally grow as big. And so you're not releasing as much carbon or in as big of an area. And so that video I sent out talks a lot about low intensity fire, prescribed fire, as a way to actually either be carbon neutral or carbon sequestering, depending on that fire cycle. So the other thing in that video that's really powerful is the difference between uplands burning and lowlands burning. Uplands release a lot less carbon when they burn. So the ridges and hilltops, there's a lot less carbon to burn, and it's generally the above ground carbon. Whereas lowlands, the peatlands, there is just an incredible amount of carbon that's being stored there. And when fire gets into that, it's a tremendous amount of carbon that's released. So I think here, looking at our forests, there's all sorts of things happening, right? You see it all the time. And I'm really talking outside of the wilderness, is the harvest of material. And so there's various types of harvest, like saw timber. Generally that's going into like 2x4s and bookshelves and stuff. And that's one way to store carbon. Yeah, this huge table probably has a lot of carbon in it. And so that's one way to store carbon with the forest products. The other thing is I think often of like secondary uses of carbon. So my property, we probably generally cutting firewood if I have a day off and cleaning out our woods there. And some people have experienced that is other uses of carbon. So so firewood is a great way to get a secondary use of carbon out. Paper, there's a lot of our forests around here produce pulp for paper. So that's generally like your aspens or like your small dimensional red pine and stuff like that can be pulped and then made out of paper. And then one thing that's been a discussion here over the last 10 plus years is biomass. Using biomass, that's a secondary use of carbon that at least that what's coming out of the forest is being utilized for something. A lot of times you'll see it, and those that have been up and down the Echo Trail lately have seen it a lot, is to reduce that balsam, that hazardous fuel underneath our forests, is we've piled it and then just open air burned it. So that's just releasing the carbon with no use of that carbon. And then the other thing, of course, is just, our forests are naturally decomposing, and various, that carbon is kind of a slow release of that carbon, or that carbon turns into other things like deer and mushrooms and stuff like that. So just thinking about that carbon in the forest and all the different ways it's completing that carbon cycle is just a really interesting, topic of discussion. And then all those management activities, like to do a timber sale or to do a prescribed fire or to do nothing. Just thinking about how that all interacts. And then, of course, during wildfire season, making really quick decisions about how to appropriately manage those fires and what the right action is when they occur, and particularly this one in the wilderness. Do you suppress it? Do you allow it to find its own natural barriers, or do you help it get to those natural barriers, or do you do nothing? Those decisions can be made fairly quickly, and a whole lot of teamwork goes into those discussions and decisions. So, all right, that was 25 minutes. I think I covered most of my notes. Thank you for your patience and holding your questions. I saw there was a couple, so we should go to Doug first.
I don't know, probably a couple different subjects here, but we got a lot more trees now than we used to have, but back before the white settlers came here, the trees were much bigger.
Mhm.
And I always read and kind of more or less believed that the old growth forests, at least in the pine forest, were the best at sequestering carbon. So I didn't hear you talk much about old growth forests. So it's something that I think we have less and less of. And I know the Forest Service is trying to maintain some old growth stock, which is really good. But isn't the logging regime change the fire regime to some extent, where in the pine forest, the old big forests, they wouldn't burn as easily, and then the natives could burn them yearly or whenever they wanted. So I think a big part of your job, I think, is to try and mitigate these big stand replacing fires to some extent, especially around communities.
Mhm.
So how successful are you doing that lately?
Yeah, it's a great question.
I'll answer part of that.
Yeah, Cass, okay.
Yeah. So it's actually the leaves, so new growth that capture the most of carbon. So the bigger trees, they don't do much carbon sequestering. So it's new growth forests that actually capture the most. But the larger trees do store that carbon easier than new growth captures it. So if you have a large tree that contains much more carbon already than smaller new growth, but that new growth is actively captured more. So when you have a mix of older trees and new growth, that means the new growth is capturing carbon and the old growth is storing it.
Okay.
But when you have, but when you have low level surface fire and you have that disturbance, you're getting a lot of new growth that's capturing carbon and it's not burning up the old growth. But when you have a stand replacing fire, it burns up the old growth as well. And that releases all the carbon that was stored in those old growth trees. And now you do have new growth, but there's a larger release at the moment of the fire.
Okay. So you're saying generally now later. Trying to figure out the best there.
Yeah.
The balance.
Yeah, and I totally agree with Cass that there's a curve that say you do have a fire and that forest starts regrowing. Well, you're really gaining a lot of carbon, and then it kind of peaks and then it probably starts diminishing. But if you look at those old growth forests, an old growth forest 200 years ago was really open with probably no balsam understory, very little balsam understory because of the repeated fire underneath. And so that forest would get truly to the state of an old growth, like 400 years old. Now we may have an old growth forest, but it's very much at risk. It's at risk of a stand replacing fire at say 200 years because of that balsam understory. Because there's a crown, so we call it ladder fuel, where it starts out a lightning strike is on the ground, and then it burns up that balsam and gets into the crown, and then it burns the whole forest.
Haven't the balsam extended itself because of logging, or no, you think so?
I would say because of the lack of fire.
Lack of fire.
Yeah, because so what we notice when we do prescribed fire is generally we do a pre-treatment of some sort of understory fuels reduction, UFR, because we love our acronyms. And so we'll remove that balsam understory, or during say a thinning, like where the logger is going in to thin some of that growth, they'll remove that balsam, or they'll mash it down and slash it, put it on the ground, and then we'll burn it. And when you burn that balsam understory, it also burns the seed base. And so you go like 25 years without balsam coming back. And so that, as far as like how widespread or what percentage of the forest is very low percentage that we're actually doing prescribed fire. It's very expensive and there's risks to it. But say, for instance, you look at that Pitcher Lake fire from, I think it was 2019 or 2018. There was a thinning that occurred and then a prescribed fire that occurred. And then during the Greenwood fire, some of the maps we have are just phenomenal, because that Greenwood fire, August 20th, just got up and ran, and it ran to the northeast, which was right towards Slate Lake. And when it hit that Pitcher Lake fire, it stopped. It came down out of the crown and it went to the ground, and it didn't even hit the Pitcher Lake road. A lot of that burning you see along the Pitcher Lake road was our firefighters going in and putting prescribed fire in there just to kind of clean up that fuel. But that fire stopped, and so that stand of timber in there now maybe has a chance of achieving the old growth status because it was protected during this fire event. Whereas had we not thinned it and not prescribed burned it, we very well could have lost that stand, and we'd be growing aspen out there today.
Besides the numbers of people now building their places all over the place, which really complicates your life. Climate change, not only warmer and drier often, but windier. And we've experienced so many major blowdowns, which I think is a ramp up from how it used to be. So all of this lumber on the ground, obviously creating fuel and making passage difficult and all that. To me, coming here and being used to so many trees, and now it seems like so many less trees than 25 years ago, because of the windstorms, windstorms every year.
Yeah, so there's a lot to that of our changing forests. So depending on forest type, you can generally say this forest has been a xeric forest, a dry forest. And that's particularly the red and white pines that were open understory on ridge tops were fairly dry. But when you get a buildup of balsam and you prevent the wind from moving through there, they become mesic. And so a wetter forest with higher humidities. And so we've noticed this in places, if you know Joe Smith out at the Ouija, he'll say it a lot. I've walked through the forest up there with him quite a bit. And the changes he's seen in his lifetime. But one thing he really notices is the red oaks that are coming in.
Mhm.
And so those red oaks really like a more mesic forest. And then, so then you start getting more and more mesic. You get maple and oak, and it gets wetter and wetter. And so that's one theory of our future, is that we'll have more oaks and maples. And then they outcompete the white pine, red pine, cedars, etc. And so like we can see a shift, and it's definitely a documented shift with climate change, that the forests are getting wetter. And so we're getting a change. And so theoretically, if that change continues and we end up with a oak maple, then we get into that disturbance regime of, 1400 to 1700 years, and we end up more of a maple forest. So that's one change. The other change that I really heard quite a bit, and people in their lifetime have noticed it here, is lightning. So the bands of lightning have kind of moved further north. And lightning is, historically the instigator of a lot of these stand replacing fires, but that's moved north. And I think we've probably seen that this summer. That's one summer, 1 year of weather, but in Canada, where that lightning went further north, and they had tremendous amount of fires up there. And we didn't have so much lightning this year. We had some pretty good storms, but not probably traditionally the amount we've had. So there are definitely climate changes in the wind. I've certainly heard that windier. But then the Timber Jay's actually done some really good articles on it, the shift in the seasons, to where fall is getting warmer and longer, and spring is maybe, a lot of our fire folks talk about, you can pretty much bank on, we start getting the rain during green up, and then our fire season's over. Well, our firefighters are like, yeah, that used to be true, but it's not a given anymore, and we need to plan on basically having fire all summer. So
I have a question related to that. I was thinking about the change, particularly with regard to maples, since I started coming up here in 1978. I mean, in the late 70s, the 80s, you'd see a red maple here, a red maple there, and they usually changed earlier in the fall than the aspens and birches did. And now there are places that look like you're in New England. I mean, there are so many more maples. They're so much larger. What you said about the xeric versus mesic was really interesting. I wonder how the maples and the oaks compete relative to the balsams. That is, what's the understory? That seems to relate to what the understory is going to be like as we go forward. And I wonder whether anybody has studied that, whether those oaks and maples are in fact out competing the balsams, and whether the increasing, how does the increasing, I think of balsams as trees that like to have damp feet. I think that's right. So I wonder,
shade.
and shade.
So I wish I could remember exactly where I learned this, but the temperature ranges. So it probably, I guess the way I've come to appreciate that, or it's the way it's stuck in my brain, is the temperature ranges have had more of an impact on some of our tree species. So balsam does better.
The temperature range is more than how wet their feet are.
Yeah,
Okay.
that we're probably getting a shift because of the temperature, the shifts in temperature. And so balsams do better they need cold winters for, like, say, the spruce budworm, to kill the spruce budworm. They need cold winters. They don't like heat. And then heat stresses them and causes issues. Whereas maple don't like the cold because it'll actually explode. And so if you get a warmer winter, that favors the maple, and if you get a colder winter, that favors the balsam. So by having just warmer years, summers and winters, we're probably shifting away from balsam and towards maple.
I think Lee Fraley has been doing some work on this.
Lee had a graduate student whose name a kid who got his PhD, I'm blanking on his name right now, but he put temperature sensors, I don't know, 150 of them through the forest, 2 of them on our property, actually.
Cool.
And to keep track of those temperatures in specific locations. He was like looking for refugios, wasn't he? Like particular habitats where plants would be able to have a better chance of surviving as the climate warms.
Sure.
But yeah, he was doing that.
Oh, I've got a question.
Sure.
We keep hearing about storage of carbon dioxide underground in forested areas. And that sure doesn't sound like a good thing to do to me, but what is your view on it?
Oh,
Are you allowed to have a view on it?
I hope so. If I can't have a view, I don't know if I wanna.
I don't understand, you're talking carbon.
Well, the
Piping.
Yeah.
CO2 pipelines.
There was some, was it, I don't know, Department of Agriculture or Interior, but somebody,
Interior, yeah.
On Friday, it was the Forest Service.
it was a Forest Service, yeah.
You guys. You say your piece, I can round it out with facts if you guys.
Well, I would only speak locally, in that, one, proper understanding of the geology is helpful to that discussion. The other thing is the infrastructure. And so I would think around here, we just really don't have the infrastructure. My previous career with the Bureau of Land Management out west, there was a lot of infrastructure, a lot of pipes and oil fields, and probably places where it was appropriate. I know when I worked in Wyoming, they were piping CO2, so you have natural gas come up or oil, and then they pump CO2 down and it pressurize the reservoir, and then it force more natural gas and so I don't know, maybe it's appropriate there. Definitely not in my wheelhouse here. So
Y'all should read your Timber Jay. This week, Katie has an article. She's not here, so I don't know. But yes, nobody should be mad at Aaron. But you can get mad at him, but not at Aaron. He didn't do anything. And yeah, I hope that article comes out. It was reported on NPR yesterday. And the draft rule dropped on Friday, and everyone has until January 2nd to do your comments. And I will be asking for more time than that, but we have 2 months, and you'll be hearing from me. Don't worry. I wanted to talk about biomass because you mentioned biomass, and as a professional environmentalist, I like to identify things I'm against. And biomass has me confused because like gigantic biomass, I'm against that. But I also burn trees in my house. And I can't assume that I'm a bad person. So I have to assume that that's okay. And you said for the last decade or so, you've been talking about biomass, and like, I've been trying to figure it out, like what the right size is, what the right use is. And I would love to know, oh, and I have a hand up.
Well, I just wanted to supplement the question. It's a little bit more general, but you were talking at the end about various forest products and carbon, potential carbon use. And this is a critique I have more of the energy sector, which is where I work more, which is that we lack planning mechanisms and places where we can sort of make holistically based decisions about how we do, and as I'm saying, in the energy sector, and you could replace that often with sort of market mechanisms and handing decision making over to industry and say, you make rational decisions about this. And so, right, like biomass being one of these things, just a question about where folks are talking about this and making decisions. Does it feel like that is something of an issue, sort of this lack of a place to make rounded decisions about this?
Barb and I kind of had a little back and forth via email And that's because recently the Forest Service announced grant funding for, we call it wood innovations, and so it's basically waste products and like finding markets for it. So the balsam piles we have all over, could that be used for something else? And so there's a lot of people talking about biomass again, because in the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act bill and IRA, since we like our acronyms, there are subsidies, there's grants, there's programs for essentially biomass or wood products. And so so that kind of precipitated with that grant proposals here in our community. And I say like 10 years ago, and maybe I can send Barb some information to forward to y'all.
Sure.
Dovetail Partners in an outfit called Wilson Engineering here in Ely. There, some of y'all here might have been participated in that effort, because they're like a community wood-fired boiler, basically down by the hospital, and would have powered the hospital, the school, the care center, and then Vermilion College has a wood boiler that was installed in the 80s. And so there was a discussion here about 10 years ago with all these questions, and basically the price of carbon or fossil fuels was cheaper than all of the infrastructure it would have taken to do biomass. But Barb and I kind of had a little back and forth about like firewood, and I burn firewood at my house and kind of keep copious
And
notes.
you're not a bad person.
Even if I am, it's not for me to judge. I'm Buddhist, so I am what I am. But let me finish that thought on firewood. And so we have a propane, forced air furnace as well. And but just on we have about 6 acres, and then all my neighbors are grateful for me to go cut wood on their place too. But I burn about 6 tons a year of firewood. And we upgraded our stove, and we got one of these really somewhat energy efficient stoves that has the catalytic converter, and when it gets going, you hit the converter and it reburns the gases and the ash. So it's fairly efficient and probably low PM 2.5 coming out the chimney. But what that's really done around our properties is greatly reduce our fire risk. And we are burning like fairly marginal wood, stuff that's been on the ground. And I have like 12 species of tree. And then I look at other people's firewood, and it's like just perfect birch that came from some logging operation. Yeah, which, no, I'm not judging anything, but I just see that the amount of having that secondary use of carbon, and then really buffering around our house so that if there is a large wildfire, it reduces our risk. And then I just see our forest, it's fun when you cut down a tree and you see the growth rings. Like I don't know, I'm always stopping and counting growth rings, but you'll just see how tight they are. And then at some point in the life of that tree, like a neighbor tree fell down, and then you see those growth rings like boom, 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 and then they get smaller again. And so I just look at my forest and see that by opening it up a little bit, that it's reduced the competition, and the trees that are there are healthier, and they're really putting on some growth. So, but then I'm not using propane. So last year, we have a 500-gallon propane tank, and like we don't even fill it up once a year. And I just think how much fossil fuel, how much carbon we're not using by burning firewood around our
If
property.
you've done everything with electric, how would that work out?
It depends on where that electric's coming from.
That's right, but it comes from the grid, and so we pretty much know what the mix is.
Yeah. So another thing about biomass with this infrastructure thing, looking into it, and speaking of So down south in the southeast, a lot of those pine forests, so what they're doing is they're actually taking pine trees, like old trees that could be 2x4s, and they're just, they're making pellets out of them, and then they're shipping them to Europe to replace coal. And so you really have to look at the whole life cycle of all of those materials. And I think of like, okay, my firewood in my stove probably doesn't have a large carbon footprint because it's not getting moved around a lot.
I might travel 30 feet to get into your house.
Yeah, and you know, it depends if I use my splitting axe for exercise or my wood splitter, and then my either electric chainsaw or a gas chainsaw, it depends. But like, so what's the carbon? What would you call it? The carbon the footprint of that versus the carbon footprint of pellets going to Denmark to replace coal. And so, like you're saying, Maggie, there has to be this great like calculation of what is ultimately better. And I think one of the red flags for me is if we're converting like a red pine into wood chips, for biomass, like a, you know, a saw log, the round wood. To me, that's a red flag. If we're using the slash or a blowdown, like we have a blowdown, and we're using that material for biomass, that's probably okay. And then on the greenwood fire, there was a lot of aspen and material that was fire charred or fire scarred that couldn't be used for pulp. And so that's sitting out there today. You know, and that might be a product that could be you know, used in biomass, but we have to do the calculations first.
So driving down Highway 1, I always wonder about those piles.
Mhm.
Do you know where they're going, or are they just sitting there and waiting?
They're gonna get burned.
And burn them all?
Yeah,
Okay.
open air burning, so.
Jeff had a question.
Another,
Jeff had a
oh,
question.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Jeff had a question.
Well, yeah, sticking on the firewood thing. Like, my neighbor, got about, probably cut down, 2 cords of balsam on an acre.
Mhm.
And anything, and they got Firewise guys were good. They cut them in like sticks, 6 or 7 feet long, but they only went up to 6 or 8 inches. So I said, may I come over to my pickup truck and throw some of those in the back of my truck? Like, you know, in a couple hours, I got a cord of balsam, which I cut and split.
Mhm.
And I didn't have to buy the split birch, where who knows where that came from. Might have been an old birch, dead birch from somewhere, but. So that was just one observation. The other observation, I've been here 60 years, and I've in '86 we purchased a completely burnt tract of land off of White Iron Lake. And I've watched a mixed forest of birch and aspen grow up from seedlings or and I actually prefer to see that the old red pine forest. It's better to watch a young forest grow up than an old one die. But my big question is on balsam removal. There's tons and I mean there's cords and cords of it put in slash piles and burnt. It reminds me of all the bad stories about slash and burn around the equator. It's no different in the tropics. So I have a question that when I would cut balsam, I got 3 options. One is to just leave it on the ground, cut up a bit, you know, the limit, lay it flat on the ground.
Mhm.
Second one is grind it up with a gas powered chipper. Or 3, burn it. And the burning is the least, in my intuition, the least big, you know. Burn it for fuel, you mean? Burn it. No, burn it to get rid of it, reduce the fire danger. So I think it's better to leave it on the ground with the proviso though, if you have a pile of balsam slash, it'll last 15 or 20 years. They're not gonna disappear. And if it's too thick, nothing's gonna grow up through it either, so it's gotta be spread out enough. But the chipping idea seems good because at least for the smaller portions, and then save the bunch for firewood. And of course, people don't like to burn balsam because you got to stay there and see it more often. And they go, oh, my chimney is gonna get full of creosote. Well, you gotta clean your chimney, but if your cabin burnt down, the environment probably would be happy because it's back,
Yeah.
you're out of the picture.
So Jeff, we must think a lot alike. I can't help but not think about these things too. And it's amazing when you're out cutting firewood with all the things you think about. And it's probably some of my best time thinking. But a couple thoughts on those thoughts is, so balsam ain't all bad. And I think we should remind ourselves, like, I know when the birds migrate through in the spring, just paying attention to where they're at, and they're in balsams. And so it is beneficial to have balsam around. It's a natural thing. Probably the number of balsam is probably exceeded historical variation. So a lot of times, and this is for me personally, like on my property, I'll remove a lot of that really small diameter stuff, and I use my my fist as if it's bigger or smaller than my fist. And if it's bigger than my fist, I'll generally leave it. If it's smaller, I'll take it. But then the other thing too,
You're making firewood out of the bigger pieces.
well, or leaving the trees, just leaving, if it's alive, I'll leave it. And if it's dead, yeah, I'll burn it, but I generally use it for like campfire wood and not in the house, because it's then I have to vacuum. What I've also come to learn is that if you cut a balsam, like a bigger diameter balsam, between say December 1st and May 1st, all the sap is out of it. And it actually makes a fairly dense firewood. And if you look at last winter's Ely winter times, there was a great little cutout of the BTU value of different species, and balsam is actually higher than white pine and red pine. And so if I choose to burn balsam in the house, I'll try to cut it between December 1st and May 1st, and then split it, and it actually ends up being pretty dense and without much. But looking at other products, so balsam can be used for fiber, for paper. And when the Verso mill was operating, there was balsam timber sales, and but it would end up being pulp. The other thing, those piles that are out there, this is where I think biomass would be a good market, is they could be chipped and then used in biomass. But it is really extremely expensive to have contractors go out and build those piles. Now, some people benefit from that, and we encourage that locally. It can be up to $2,500 an acre. And so sometimes the work we're doing to reduce the balsam costs more than the land is worth. And
it's not a scalable solution for the whole continent.
No, yeah, and thankfully the whole continent isn't there, but even just locally, millions of dollars are spent to reduce that. And if you're, I guess with my bias, if you don't put prescribed fire in there, well, in 25 years, you're going to do it again, because that seed is still there. And so it's just going to come right back. Whereas if you do a prescribed fire, then you're removing that seed as well. So I think, yeah, there's other markets for that balsam potentially, that is worth I think it's worth its own probably climate group discussion on biomass.
Yeah, I think so.
Sounds like I should just start bringing it all, making a pile in front of the hospital as a hint that they should.
Well, maybe if Vermilion campus here.
Okay, yeah, that's
if
closer to my.
I think they're working on some engineering to a more modern, efficient boiler, and then that study is out there. It's like 850 cords a year is what that would use, which you can get about 20 tons off of an acre of biomass, depending on the forest area. So it's 40 acres a year.
Okay, last question to Bill.
Okay, I was thinking more of the bigger landscape. We've talked a lot about individual choice
Mhm.
in places. And maybe one of the benefits is that we have Agencies in different jurisdictions approaches to the forest, and we have the outside the boundary waters versus inside the boundary waters, so we theoretically can have high intensity fires occur, even though that's harder with the amount of people that are recreational users and all the other things, but we are a mixed forest, and with climate change is one of the factors that you brought up, maple trees exploding and things like that. There's been that discussion that winters that get below 40 degrees below compared to the ones that don't, serve different species. That's why you have your range maps of species cutting off at various points. And so with that changing, that adds another whole dynamic to the thing. But I guess what I keep thinking of is that of the wildlife, there's some ecological aspects of a mixed forest. And you've got the maples you mentioned and the birch and aspen, which can regenerate. You've got the birch and aspen, which aren't shade tolerant, and maples are, and oaks aren't. And so, all of those dynamics are going on in this decision making. And so it's not like one approach. It seemed like when I came here in the late 70s, whatever got cut was mostly clear cuts and replanted to red pine and white spruce. That was, and so that was just uniformly doing it. And so I think having one approach doesn't serve the area well.
Yeah.
Some areas need more fire safety and others don't. So I don't know how you approach planning on that level.
Well, this is a good segue for closing out. For you.
Thank you.
So the next things here on the Kawishiwi District that y'all, I hope, actively participate in is on the Fernberg corridor. We're doing an environmental analysis for the forest. So it's the Fernberg corridor, then it loops around to the Tomahawk Road, and that will be going out for scoping in December. And so there'll be a public scoping comment period that you can participate. Right now, we're planning on an open house December 7th at the Kawishiwi District, I think from 4 to 6 p.m. And
will Smokey the Bear be at that one?
No, Smokey hibernates this time of year.
He's
So
gonna be at the Duluth one.
Everybody knows.
well, it's warmer down there.
It's not
So
warmer. They got the Lake of Texas.
So we're gonna be working on that. And one thing that we're doing, because we have the high-low area up there by Burnside and the Echo Trail, a lot of acres of wildland urban interface. Ely is the #2 highest risk fire shed in the eastern region of the Forest Service. Not something we want to be known for. And so
Just because we got a lot of trees.
a lot of trees right next to a lot of people.
Yeah. We put
And,
houses in there.
No way to get out.
So there's a lot of effort being done. So what we're doing with the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act is we're actually hiring 2 people. One of them is the Nature Conservancy, will be an employee of the Nature Conservancy, and they'll be doing fuels planning adjacent to the Forest Service. So looking at the landscape versus the land ownership. And so that person will help like integrate adjacent lands into Forest Service projects. So we're looking at natural features on the land instead of land ownership. The other person that we're hiring, and that'll be going out soon as a job announcement, is a fire shed coordinator, and that's with Dovetail Partners. And that person will be working really with the agencies, state, county, Forest Service, Firewise, Natural Resource Conservation Service, and the Soil Water Conservation Districts, to integrate all of those grants and work. There's just a lot of paperwork that goes into permissions to do the work. Sometimes the state DNR will cut timber on Forest Service land and the Forest Service will do prescribed fire on state land. And so there's all sorts of coordination and work and efforts that's doing to, make that legal and, liabilities and all sorts of things. So, pay attention for that, Fernberg scoping. And then also those, 2 employees that will be partnering with us. And they'll be working out of the Kawishiwi District office, so.
Ooh, wow, bravo, thank you. very much.
Hey, thank you.
Everybody remember to vote. You vote today. Gotta vote. It's voting day.
How do I stop this?
Barb, some years ago, Forest Committee